Good afternoon, Boulevard Christian Church. Glad you are joining us today for Bible study time. My name's Jim. I am the student pastor, and we are doing our study through the book of James. It's been really good so far, and it's been awesome. As you can tell, I am not in the offices because as James is talking about trials and temptations, the Landis family is currently going through trials and temptations. One of my temptations right now, came home to find my boys got the chicken nuggets for lunch. Temptation. I'm trying to avoid it. And a trial that I'm going through right now is that my son is currently attempting to take a nap in the other room. There's a really solid chance that he will be coming out in the middle of this. And so if you see me turn my head and yell, I'm not going crazy. I'm just trying to tell him to go back to his room, right? We have another trial going on at the Landis house. The reason why I am home is because my youngest son, Isaac, was on a slide the other day. And that's not too abnormal, but what he decided to do was to go backwards up the slide. And when he went up the slide, he fell down. Even that wasn't too much. But what he ended up doing, falling down on his teeth, chipped his tooth. And normally, it's a baby tooth. Wouldn't think it's that big of a deal, but Jackie took him to the dentist. And so I'm at home with my youngest son, or my oldest son, Zeke, while they're at the dentist. So the Landis family is facing trials. We are facing temptations, but I'm sure that there are worse things that could happen. And so we are in our study through the book of James. And today we are going to be in chapter 1, starting in verse 13. That's where we're going to be through the book of James in our study time right now. Right, the book of James, something that James kind of opened up during the intro is kind of alluded to who James really was and the author of the book. And just some quick cliff notes about it is this was the brother of Jesus Christ. But one of the interesting things is James didn't actually believe that Jesus was who he said he was until after Jesus died, and James, his brother, saw the resurrected Jesus. You can find that in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's just interesting to find out that this guy, James, who's the author of the book James, wasn't even a believer of his brother Jesus until he saw him resurrected, which I think is a cool apologetic deal with the proof of the resurrection. Another deal with James is he was the leader of the Jerusalem church. And the reason why that's a big deal is because all this started in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the apostles were, and when the explosion happened and persecution, and when in the book of Acts, when everything started to spread out, home base was still in Jerusalem. And so James stayed there, and James was actually a leader in the church of Jerusalem. You see this in Acts chapter 15, where some Christians, some Jewish Christians, started to have a dispute on exactly who was able to receive the gospel, or if you are a Gentile, how do you have to become a Jew first before you become a Christian? And so they had this big dispute, and what they had to do is they actually went to Jerusalem to ask them what was going on. And guess who was the leader in Jerusalem that stood up and spoke on behalf of all Christians? It was James. And so here's James. He is an absolute stud. And so his book is a lot different than a lot of other epistles we have in the Bible. A lot of the other epistles will discuss some theology, and James certainly has theology in it. But it will discuss kind of some more steps of the faith. James comes right on out and says, here's what you do if you're a follower of him. Here's what you don't do if you're a follower of him. And just really comes right out and just kind of throws it at you and just says, don't miss this, and puts it right out. James is one of my favorite books to teach through just because it is just right there. It's super practical and can really jump right on in to the life of a believer. So far, what James and Randy and Carrie have kind of discussed was through some of the book of James, and one of the deals that really we talked about was trials, and basically just came out and said, hey, trials are a part of life. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are not exempt. If you become a follower of Jesus, it doesn't just change for you. You are always going to have trials. It's part of life. It doesn't change if you follow Jesus. Reality is the part that we are into today with temptation, same thing applies. Just because you are a follower of Jesus does not make you exempt from the temptation that is going to happen in your life. I wrote down a note here, and since I'm not in the office, I don't have my pens. So what I have, I got a pink pen of Jackie's as well as pink writing. So we will see how this goes. Talk about trials and temptations. And so here we are talking about the idea of temptation. Here's what I wrote down is, this might sound weird, but sometimes it's not all that important just to avoid temptation altogether, because you can't. It's impossible. Just like it's impossible to avoid all trials, it's impossible to avoid all pain. It is impossible to always avoid all temptation. So sometimes the most important thing isn't just avoiding the temptation, but the best and most important thing you can do is, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with that thought that pops inside your head, or that urge or that craving that you want to carry out with the fleshly desires, as the scriptures like to say? Something that James says, and I actually want to just read it here. See, we have my Bible right here. I want to read the passage with you guys, and then as we read, then we'll kind of go back and reiterate some of it. All right, so James chapter 1, starting in verse 13, it says this: when tempted, again, it's not if tempted, but when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. James goes on to write in verse 16, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, and that we might be a kind of first fruits that he created. So we're kind of going to go through this text now, and the first thing he says is when tempted. Notice it's not if. When you are tempted, how do you handle it? So you see, the first thing I think we need to know is it's not super important that you just avoid temptation all around. The question is, what do you do when you are tempted? Another truth he kind of goes through this is that the origin of sin and the origin of this temptation, it's not God. Sometimes it's not even Satan himself. We like to give Satan a lot more credit than he deserves. Sometimes the origin of our sin and our temptation, it's us. It's you. We like to say around Boulevard, hey, it's not about us, it's about God. You know, God is God and I am not. But here's something we can't take credit for. We are sinful. That we are sinful people, and we don't need a whole lot of help creating that. We don't need a whole lot of help fleshing that out, because that is who we are. It's no surprise that you could look back through all of Scripture, and where sin even originated was us. Look at Adam and Eve. And I think it's interesting. You know, I work with students most of the time, and I do some things with adults and some things with children. So I work with all ages of people. And the same mindset about sin plays out throughout all age groups. Doesn't matter if you are a child or if you are a student or an adult, because sin we like to just kind of throw away and blame somebody else. The blame game is super popular when we start talking about sin. When it comes to blessing, we like to take it, but when it comes to sin, we like to kind of push it away. And so one of the things that I've noticed is when you look throughout Scripture, that sin is always being pushed off to other people. Here, James is saying, listen, when you are tempted, when evil is lurking about, that's not God doing that. Probably yourself. It's your own evil. It's my own desires and my own urges. It's where it originates. Think about Adam and Eve. Like, they started the blame game. Whenever they took a bite of the apple, and Adam, who did Adam blame? Eve. He said, this woman that you brought to me here, she gave me the fruit. It's not my fault, it's hers. And then when Eve speaks up, she doesn't say, yeah, you're right, Adam, my bad. She actually ends up saying, actually, no, it was that serpent. That serpent was really crazy and really crafty. And that serpent is, oh, there's Isaac. How's your tooth, buddy? Jackie, say hi to live.
Hi, everybody.
All right, you go take a nap, buddy. I love you. I knew it was going to happen. I knew it. And so And then when Adam and Eve started blaming each other, then even the serpent, when it originated the sin, the serpent comes out and goes, maybe it's God's fault. Like, he just doesn't want you to know everything. He doesn't want you to be a part of everything. He knows that if you eat some, that you'll be like him. Like, sin is always this evolving game in which we try to blame other people. Until we take responsibility, until we recognize it originated with me and that I am a sinful person. That is when we can start handling temptation, start handling sin in the right, proper ways. In verse 15, it kind of goes through this progression. And here's what James writes. Actually, starting in verse 14 and then goes to 15. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Think of it whenever a child, right? A child is born. I remember when Jackie and I first got pregnant with Zeke, our first kid, and it started off like we went to the doctor, and the doctor was like, "Hey, here's the size of your little tiny baby. He's 8 weeks old," and we were so excited. It was so cute. Jackie got an app, and the app would tell you how big the baby was getting, and it always compared it to fruit or something, and be like, "Oh, it's the size of this, and now it's the size of a pear, and now it's the size of a cantaloupe." And so it was interesting to watch the progression of our child as he was developing inside Jackie's womb. And it's funny now, he's 3 years old. He'll be 4 in October, to see how big he's gotten. And sometimes we'll talk to him and say, "You know, at one point you were inside mama's belly." And he goes, no, there's no way. I'm way too big. We try to explain to him, well, you see, you've grown. And so you weren't always this big, but you've really grown. And what's crazy to see is working with students is a student might be gone for a week or 2 weeks or maybe even a month. They come back and I swear they grew a foot. Like at just that age in junior high, some of the boys and the girls, like you won't see them for a little bit and they'll grow like a whole foot. And you're like, holy smokes, like how did you get so big so fast? Same thing happens with sin. You see our little baby that started off as just this little small little thing inside Jackie's belly has grown up. He's almost 4 years old. He'll be taking classes and going to school here pretty soon. But he's not going to stay little. He's not going to stay like right now we wrestle and I don't have to try very hard. But at some point, whenever we start wrestling, he's going to whoop me because he's no longer small. He's really big. What's really going to blow my mind is when we get to the age of being grandparents and to think that my little 3-year-old right now will be old enough to be a dad and to see where he has grown. Some of you have had kids. Some of you have kids that have grown so much. Maybe they're adults right now and you're thinking, I remember when you were this tiny little baby. That's the picture that James is writing here. But he's not saying this is a cute baby. What he's saying is this is how sin works. It starts off small and then it grows and it grows and it grows. See, nobody starts off with sin and says like, hey, I'm just going to start really small. And then I'm just going, actually, everyone starts off thinking it's no big deal. And they're just going to start real small and it won't go anywhere from there until it doesn't. And it goes and it goes and it goes. I don't know anybody that has such a big issue in their life right now that ever started off being like, you know what? I'm going to be an alcoholic today. Or you know what? I can't wait to ruin my family and to cheat at my job and to steal from my company. I can't wait to have zero integrity. I can't wait to be so stuck in this hole that I can't see out. See, it always starts small and it always says, hey, it's not that big of a deal. But it grows and it grows and it grows. And what James says is sin never stops. And what it continues to do, it continues to grow until it equals death. One of the things that I'm trying not to be surprised by anymore is when sin gets so large that it overtakes an individual, that it overtakes a family. Because James is telling you right here, sin always leads to death. In this life or the next, sin is always going to lead to death. Goes on to say this, it doesn't just stop with sin, doesn't stop with temptation, but he goes on and he gives you this contrast. If sin is bait and switch, if it promised you is not that big of a deal, the blessing of God is not a bait and switch. It's not a trick. And it's a promise that's littered throughout all of Scripture, is that if you strive for Him, if you call on Him, if you pray to Him, if you get in a community with Him, things always work out for the good. You see what James writes when he's talking about God's consistency here. It says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. While sin is always changing and shifting, and whoever's watching this video or commenting, you know that you struggle with something different from the next person, and then maybe in a year it'll be something else, because it's always changing, always shifting based on our desires. But at what point do we recognize sin is always keeps on bait and switch, and my desires and what I think I want until it kills me? But the blessing of God is consistent throughout all time. If sin is promising to kill you, God is promising here to give you life. See, what God offers is it's not something that'll take everything away from you. It's the opposite. It's to give you fulfillment. But you don't have to read too far into the book of James to see that it's not about never going through difficult times. It's not about avoiding all trials. It's not about avoiding all temptations. Because what God says here is that I always fulfill in the long term. It's not about short-term gratification, but this long-lasting peace. See, what he won't take away are your trials. What he won't take away are your temptations. But here's the promise that he promises to give you: fulfillment. And he promises to give you peace. See, there's a beautiful Hebrew word here called shalom. And it's a word that is used all throughout the Bible, but also you hear it all the time today. Shalom, shalom, shalom. And oftentimes whenever we say the word peace, at least in my mind, I'm thinking of the absence of violence. Like peace is just means that, hey, nobody's fighting. It's peaceful in the Landis household right now. But this shalom, this peace that God is offering us, says this: it's not about just an absence of violence, but a constant state of just being. Imagine being so confident and so peaceful that it's not this constant back and forth, but no matter what's going on, what trials, what temptations, what good or what bad has happened in your life, that you have a constant state of peace, a constant state of shalom. You know, sometimes we sing a song in church and say, "It is well with my soul." And whenever I was singing that, I kind of just sang because the words were coming on the screen, but it wasn't until I actually experienced real peace in my life that I was like, this makes sense now. Because it doesn't matter what's going on. It doesn't matter how chaotic things are going. It is well with my soul. That's what God offers us. See, this is a process, church. This is a process. You will never get to a place in your life here on earth which you will say, I no longer struggle with sin. I'm no longer tempted by the things of the flesh. See, it's an ongoing process until the day we meet with Jesus again. James is not saying your trials will be taken away, your temptations are going to be taken away. He says they are here. But recognize them where they are, where they come from, and recognize that God offers something more. I want to end with this, that James doesn't just say to avoid temptation, right? Doesn't say just avoid it. Try as hard as you can. No, he says actively avoid it and run towards the good gifts that God has to offer you. See, avoiding temptation isn't about just your effort to avoid doing something, but it's to actively pursue God instead of actively pursuing your desires. See, in recovery, we have this term called white knuckling it. And it's for anybody that's battling with whatever issues, whether it's CR stuff or whatever it may be, in which we just think we're trying to avoid this behavior or this action or this thought process. And we call it white knuckling because we just sit here and we're like, I'm trying as hard as I can. I'm trying to avoid. There's another 24 hours. Then we wake up the next day. And we're trying hard again. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's just called white knuckling it. And sometimes that works for a short term. But if you're just avoiding an action instead of running towards something else, honestly, you're not even in recovery. You're just avoiding whatever bad behavior you desire to do. Here's what God is telling you to do is don't just avoid temptation, run towards Jesus. To run towards God, to run towards community and study and a life full of prayer, a life of service, a life of commitment to something beyond yourself. Because if your goal is to sit in a corner and just be a little good girl or be a little good boy and just make sure you don't mess up, I think you're missing the opportunity that God has for you. And honestly, as a church, if we just kind of sit on the sideline and say, hey, let's just not mess up. Like, let's just not do anything bad. Let's avoid all controversy. Let's make sure that we kind of lay it low and just kind of ride the wave until Jesus comes back. I don't think we're being the church that God designs us to be. So he tells you, don't just avoid sin. Don't just avoid temptation. Run towards God. And if you're in recovery, you know this, that if you're not actively pursuing a life that God has designed for you, that you're not actually you're not recovering from anything. You're just avoiding whatever thing you have going on. I wrote down this phrase I heard a long, long time ago, and it's always in my mind. If you're not moving forward in something, you're losing ground. Like if you're not constantly moving forward, you are constantly losing ground. And you may think I'm sitting still, so I'm good, I'm neutral. And honestly, you're not. You're honestly not. See, the Bible has a lot to say about how we avoid sin. And it's never just a passive thing. Just sit here and wait for it to cross on by. 2 Timothy 2:22 tells you to flee, to get up and run. 1 Corinthians 6 says the same thing, to flee. Later on in James chapter 4, it's going to tell you actively resist the devil. Resist him. Don't just wait for him to pass by. Don't just wait for your evil desires to go ahead and go down the road. Actively pursue it. 1 Timothy and even 1 Timothy 6 says flee. And not just flee, but as you're fleeing to actually pursue righteousness. Book of Colossians chapter 3 says, put to death. Put to death. Don't just wait for it to die. You actively go to put to death. Man, following Jesus, I just wish, and I know that you have the same hope that I have and the same life that I have, and whatever story of temptation or trials you've gone through or currently going through, I just wish other people had it. That they knew it's not something we are doing alone. It is not something that we're just trying really hard to avoid, but it is something that we are doing together as a church body and as a church committed to being the body of Christ here in Muskogee and throughout the world. Listen, man, I absolutely love this study that we are doing through James. I challenge you to read it. I challenge you to get involved in the things we are going on. Remember, it is not just about avoiding sin, about avoiding temptation. It's about how do you handle that. And if you are anything like me, if you try to handle it by yourself, it's not going to go very well. But if you handle it within community, the community of the church, the community of other Christ followers, that we have a job to do. And it's not just about avoiding sin. It's not about sitting in the corner. It's about actively pursuing the life that God has designed for us. See, God is not the author of temptation, but he is the author of all the good gifts that come from above. Pursue those gifts and flee from temptation, church. I love you guys. Hope you have a good one.